Whispers of the wind. The wind tore at Mary's shawl, flinging her hair like barbed wire across her vision. This was no gentle valley breeze, but a wild, predatory force, murmuring unintelligible threats. Beside her, Thomas, lost in his own world, droned a monotonous tune. The wagon wheels protested against the uneven ground, and the landscape unfolded, a dreary panorama of scrub brush and stunted trees. She gripped the rough fabric, a cold dread settling in her stomach. The bright spark of hope that had fueled their journey now guttered like a lamp in a hurricane. "Are you certain about this, Thomas?" she asked, her voice swallowed by the wind's shriek. He ceased his humming, a shadow of irritation clouding his features. "Of course, Mary. Father and mother promised fertile land. We'll make a good life." His tone rang hollow, echoing the wind's bluster instead of the steadfastness she yearned for. By late afternoon, they reached the settlement, a sparse collection of rude cabins huddled against the wilderness, like frightened animals seeking shelter. Grim-faced figures materialized, their countenances marked by hardship and suspicion. Thomas's parents stood among them, their expressions unyielding. "So, you finally arrived," his mother stated, her voice sharp. "About time, too." Thomas straightened his shoulders, attempting a confidence he didn't possess. "We're here now, Mother." Eager to begin. Their allotted land was a patch of stony ground, overshadowed by a somber forest. Mary's spirits plummeted. It was a far cry from Thomas's fertile promises. "It's untamed," she offered, forcing a smile. His father grunted. "Untamed is what you get. Don't expect paradise, girl. This is toil, and you'll earn your keep." The following days dissolved into a grueling cycle of labor. They felled timber, moved boulders, and painstakingly began raising their cabin. Thomas, never robust, proved more of a liability. His energy flagged with each axe swing, and his complaints grew tiresome. Mary labored without cease, her hands raw and bleeding, driven by a fierce determination. She envisioned a home, a sanctuary of warmth and security, a refuge from the world's harshness. Thomas's parents scrutinized their every action, doling out unwanted advice and thinly disguised reprimands. His mother, in particular, seemed intent on finding fault. "You're holding the hammer wrong, Mary. Thomas needs more sustenance. You're wasting precious water." Mary swallowed her resentment, reminding herself that they were family and that she should be appreciative. But the constant observation eroded her resolve. One twilight, as the setting sun painted the sky in fiery shades, Mary cleared a small plot of land near the cabin. Ignoring the protesting ache in her body, she carefully sowed seeds rescued from her former home: beans, squash, and a few treasured herbs. It was a small act, a quiet defiance against the surrounding desolation, a nascent symbol of hope pushing upward from the unforgiving soil. Thomas watched from the doorway of the unfinished cabin, his face an enigma. "Why bother, Mary?" he asked, his voice filled with resignation. "The earth is barren. Nothing will take root." Mary remained silent. She gently tamped down the earth, her fingers lingering on the cool, moist soil. She would tend this garden, coaxing life from the infertile ground. She would prove him wrong. Days drifted into weeks. The cabin gradually took shape, its crude walls offering a semblance of protection from the elements. But the wind's whispers intensified, growing more persistent. And Mary, despite her efforts, couldn't dispel the feeling of an approaching storm, one far more perilous than any she'd known. She noticed Thomas spending increasing amounts of time with his parents, his face etched with worry. She attempted to speak with him, to offer solace, but he remained aloof, his eyes reflecting a fear she couldn't comprehend. The garden, however, flourished. Tiny green shoots pierced the soil, a fragile promise of plenty. Mary cared for them with fierce dedication, clinging to the hope they embodied, a beacon against the gathering darkness. Building dreams. The frame ascended against a sky stained violet and indigo. Mary gritted her teeth, muscles ablaze, as she wrestled the bulky beam. Beside her, Thomas strained, color high in his cheeks. Despite his unassuming appearance, She knew he possessed surprising strength, though such exertion often left him wan and withdrawn. Upward, she urged, and they pushed in concert, the wood complaining as it shifted into position. The first wall stood erect, a gaunt silhouette against the fading light. A jolt of unexpected triumph coursed through Mary. They were actually doing this. They were building their future. Nearly lost it, Thomas muttered, swiping perspiration from his forehead. A tremor ran through his fingers. We did it, Mary echoed, striving to match his tone of exhaustion. Together, he offered a wan smile, his gaze drifting past her to the distant scattering of buildings that constituted his parents' property. The following weeks dissolved into a blur of physical labor and raw materials. Mary hewed timber, moved boulders, and troweled mortar until her skin was chapped and raw. Thomas lent a hand, but his heart remained elsewhere. Increasingly, he disappeared to assist his family, leaving Mary to toil alone. She voiced no complaint, yet a seed of bitterness took root in her gut with each unfilled space at her side. One evening, following an especially brutal day, they sat on the packed earth floor of their nascent home, sharing a meager portion of stew. The fire chuckled contentedly, painting the bare walls with flickering shapes. The sharp scent of pine mingled with the earthy aroma of the ground. We'll have a proper table before long, Mary ventured, attempting a note of optimism. And chairs, perhaps even a woven rug. Thomas listlessly swirled the contents of his bowl. Perhaps, he repeated, his voice flat. She reached out and clasped his hand. His skin felt cool and damp, his grip feeble. We'll have a family, Thomas. Children echoing through these rooms. Joy. He remained unresponsive, his gaze fixed on the flames, his thoughts inscrutable. Some days later, Mary discovered Thomas in a lean-to behind the cabin, surrounded by curls of wood. He was bent over a piece of lumber, meticulously carving with a pocket knife. "What are you making?" she inquired. He glanced up, startled, then quickly averted his eyes. "Just something." She drew nearer, peering over his shoulder. It was a cradle. Small, unadorned, but undeniably a cradle. The wood shone, plain smooth, the lines elegant and simple. A knot tightened in Mary's throat. She hadn't witnessed such focus, such vitality in him for months. A wave of renewed hope washed over her, briefly obscuring the resentment she had been nursing. "It's beautiful, Thomas," she breathed. He offered no response, continuing his carving, his brow creased in concentration. The only sound, the whisper of the blade meeting wood. As she observed him, a troubling notion began to form. Was it a promise of what was to come, or an act of contrition, a tangible representation of the future they so desperately desired, or a futile attempt to atone for some unspoken failing? Hope began to ebb, supplanted by a heavy unease. The cradle, in all its loveliness, resembled not a dream, but a delicate wooden prison. Winter's grip. The first flakes arrived like hesitant whispers, then escalated into a furious shout. Winter had been threatening, a low growl on the horizon. But now it was here, a snarling beast clawing at the edges of their precarious existence. The wind howled, rattling the ill-fitting logs of their cabin and sending snow swirling through the cracks. Mary stuffed rags into the gaps, her fingers numb despite the fire burning fitfully in the hearth. Thomas was outside, wrestling with a fallen branch that threatened to crush the lean-to where they kept their meager supply of firewood. She watched him through the grime-streaked window, his shoulders hunched against the biting wind. He looked smaller somehow, defeated. He hadn't spoken much in the last few weeks, his silences growing longer and heavier. The weight of his family, the farm he'd left behind, seemed to press down on him with every gust of wind. She rubbed her swollen belly, a dull ache, a constant reminder of the life growing within. A life she wasn't sure she wanted to bring into this harsh world. Resentment, a bitter weed, had taken root in her heart. Resentment towards Thomas, towards the land, towards the fate that had brought her here. The blizzard raged for 3 days, trapping them inside. They ate sparingly, stretching their dwindling supplies. The silence between them thickened, punctuated only by the roar of the wind and the crackling of the fire. Mary felt the first sharp pangs on the third day, a tightening in her abdomen that stole her breath. She tried to ignore it, attributing it to the cold, to the hunger. But the pangs grew stronger, closer together, a relentless drumbeat announcing the inevitable. She gripped the edge of the rough-hewn table, her knuckles white. "Thomas," she gasped, her voice barely audible above the storm. He looked up, his eyes dull with fatigue. "What is it?" "The baby, it's coming." His face paled. He fumbled with his hands, unsure what to do. He had delivered calves, tended to sick animals, but a human birth, that was different. He helped her to the bed they shared, a crude mattress stuffed with straw. The pain intensified, a searing fire that consumed her. She screamed, a primal sound lost in the howling wind. Thomas wrung his hands, his face etched with helplessness. He boiled water, tore strips of cloth, muttered prayers he barely remembered. Hours blurred into an eternity of agony. The small cabin became a prison, the storm a malevolent audience to her suffering. Finally, with a final, wrenching surge, the baby came. Silence. Mary lay, panting, exhausted, waiting for the cry. But there was nothing. Thomas cut the cord, his hands trembling. He wrapped the baby in a clean cloth, his face a mask of grief. He turned to Mary, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. It's not alive, Mary." The words were a hammer blow to her heart. Numbness spread through her, a cold blanket stifling the pain. She stared at the small bundle in Thomas's arms, a life that had never been. He laid the baby beside her, a tiny, still form. Mary reached out a trembling hand and touched its cheek, cold and lifeless. The storm raged outside, a mournful dirge for the child that would never breathe. Thomas stood there, tears freezing on his cheeks, the cradle he had been secretly carving hidden beneath the floorboards, a testament to a hope that had died with the dawn. Winter's grip had tightened, claiming not just the land, but their future, their hope, their child. Seeds of blame. The cold had infiltrated the cottage's very core. Each inhale rasped with icy needles, and a meager fire offered scant relief. Mary lay motionless, a void where burgeoning life should have flourished. Beside her, Thomas knelt, his hand hovering above her barren womb, hesitant to intrude upon her stillness, unsure if she registered his presence. Then came the sound, not a child's cry, but the crunch of hooves on the frosted ground outside. Thomas tensed, anxiety tightening its grip. He'd summoned no one. He'd preferred to face this alone. His parents filled the doorway, their expressions etched with the harshness of winter and harsher judgments. Martha, swathed in woolen layers, her gaze like sharpened steel, scanned the room, her disapproval immediate and palpable. Samuel, a silent sentinel built of enduring oak, exuded an unspoken condemnation. "Thomas," Martha's voice sliced through the air. "Why this delay in informing us?" He rose, his posture defeated. There was naught to be done. The babe. The words wouldn't form. Martha brushed past him, her attention fixed on Mary. "Let me look at her." Mary remained unresponsive, lost in a private wilderness of sorrow and bitterness as she stared at the ceiling's rough beams. Martha descended to her side, her hand mirroring Thomas's earlier hesitation, yet her touch seemed more assessing than compassionate. "She appears intact." The word hung, weighted with unspoken censure. A spark of resentment flickered within Thomas. "She nearly perished, mother." Samuel finally broke his silence, his voice a deep resonance. A resilient woman would have averted this outcome. Mary's eyes snapped towards Samuel, a defiant glint igniting within their depths. "I expended every effort. Every effort." Martha scoffed. "Did prayers abound? Was nourishment adequate? Or did you merely recline, ballooning into indolence while Thomas toiled?" Thomas stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Enough. She's consumed by grief. And what of you, Thomas?" Martha pivoted, her voice escalating. "You allowed this to transpire. You favored this frail creature over a woman who could gift you robust sons, a woman of strong, enduring lineage. He recoiled as if struck, her words finding their mark. He had selected Mary, defying their objections. He'd been so captivated, so blinded by her allure and spirit, that he'd dismissed their warnings. Now, the weight of their censure, magnified by the loss, threatened to crush him. She labored tirelessly. He offered weakly, the defense sounding hollow even to his own ears. The winter inflicted hardship on all. Hard labor. Martha spat. A farmer's wife demands more than delicate hands. She requires fortitude, resilience, the capacity to bring forth healthy offspring. Samuel placed a weighty hand upon Thomas's shoulder. She failed you, son. She failed us all. You merit better. Thomas glanced from his parents to Mary, her face stained with tears. He observed the pain in her eyes, yet he also discerned a flicker of simmering resentment. He was ensnared, torn between the woman he cherished and the family he desperately needed. He attempted to speak, to defend Mary, to quell his parents' accusations, but his tongue felt leaden. He could sense their disappointment, their disapproval, seeping into him, tainting his very thoughts. The silence stretched, punctuated only by Mary's shallow breaths. Thomas gazed at her, and for the first time, he perceived not only his wife but also the embodiment of his parents' scorn. The seed of guilt had been sown, and he wondered, with growing apprehension, if it would ever be eradicated. A broken vow. The silence in the cabin was a heavy blanket, smothering the last embers of hope. Mary hadn't moved from the rocking chair since the emptiness had become a permanent resident in her womb. Her eyes, usually bright with laughter, were now dull pools reflecting the flickering firelight. Thomas shifted his weight from foot to foot, the floorboards groaning under his unease. He'd been avoiding her gaze for days, a cowardice that ate at him more than his parents' endless disapproval. He reeked of it now, the stink of their disappointment clinging to his clothes like wood smoke. His mother's voice, sharp and unforgiving, echoed in his ears. "This is a disgrace, Thomas. A blight on our family. A bastard child and a barren wife. You must put an end to it." His father's words were laced with a chilling calm. "We gave you a good name, a good farm. Don't throw it all away on this tragedy." He tried to argue, feebly at first. He'd sworn a vow, to love, to cherish, in sickness and in health. But their faces were stone, their wills unyielding. The farm, the legacy, the family name, it was all held hostage, dependent on his compliance. The door creaked open, and his parents stood framed in the doorway, their silhouettes ominous against the fading light. His mother's face was tight, her lips a thin, disapproving line. His father's jaw was clenched. They hadn't bothered to knock. "She needs to leave," his mother stated, her voice devoid of warmth. "This house is not a charity. She has no claim here." Mary didn't react. She simply stared into the fire, the flames dancing in her lifeless eyes. Thomas swallowed hard, the lump in his throat thick and painful. He looked at Mary, her face gaunt, her body fragile. He remembered the day they'd married, the joy that had radiated from her, the promises he'd whispered in her ear. He looked back at his parents, their faces implacable, their judgment unwavering. He felt a coldness settle in his heart, a numbness that spread through his limbs. He was trapped, a puppet dancing to their tune. "Mary," he began, his voice barely a whisper. He hated the tremor in it, the weakness that betrayed him. I can't." She finally looked at him, her eyes searching his. He saw the flicker of hope, the desperate plea for reassurance. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I can't support you anymore," he choked out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "My parents, they won't allow it." A single tear traced a path down Mary's cheek, a silent testament to his betrayal. The hope in her eyes died, replaced by a profound and devastating emptiness. She rose slowly from the rocking chair, her movements stiff and deliberate. She didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't even look at him. She simply walked to the meager chest that held her few belongings. Thomas watched her, paralyzed by guilt and shame. He wanted to stop her, to beg her forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. He was a prisoner of his own making, bound by the chains of his parents' expectations. She gathered her shawl, the worn fabric offering little protection against the coming winter. She didn't take anything else, not even the small wooden doll he'd carved for her when they were courting. As she reached the door, she paused, her back to him. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "I thought you were a man of your word." Then, without another word, she stepped out into the cold, leaving Thomas alone in the cabin with his parents and the crushing weight of his broken vow. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing like a death knell in the oppressive silence. He sank to his knees, the firelight casting long, distorted shadows on the walls, and finally allowed himself to weep. Lost and found. The cabin door slammed behind her, the sound echoing the finality in her heart. Mary stumbled down the worn path, each step heavy with shame and despair. The morning sun, usually a welcome sight, felt harsh and accusatory, mirroring the glare she received from the few settlers already stirring. "There she is," a woman hissed, pulling her child closer as Mary passed. The little girl stared, wide-eyed, and Mary averted her gaze, her cheeks burning. Whispers followed her like a persistent cloud of gnats. "Unnatural, a curse, best kept away from." The words stung, each one a tiny barb tearing at her already wounded spirit. She hadn't known such cruelty existed here, in this supposed haven of community. The shared hardships, the common goal of survival, she believed, would bind them together. Instead, they had turned on her, fueled by superstition and fear. Her grief, her pain, was irrelevant. She was simply the woman whose baby died, the woman tainted by misfortune. Mary walked aimlessly, the path blurring through her tears. The settlement, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a prison, its boundaries closing in on her. The smell of wood smoke, usually comforting, now choked her with a reminder of the life she had lost, the home she had been banished from. She reached the edge of the woods, the trees a dark and imposing wall. The familiar scent of damp earth and pine needles offered a small measure of solace, a reminder of the wild, untamed beauty that still existed beyond the confines of human judgment. But even that couldn't pierce the crushing weight of her despair. Her legs gave way. She sank to the ground, the rough earth digging into her skin. The sobs that racked her body were silent, desperate. She curled into herself, wishing for the earth to swallow her whole. There was nothing left. No baby, no husband, no home, no hope. The world began to fade. The sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the distant chirping of birds, seemed to grow fainter, replaced by a dull, throbbing silence. Her eyes fluttered closed. Elias found her there, crumpled at the base of a towering oak. He'd been on his way to check his snares, his mind preoccupied with the dwindling supplies and the responsibility of feeding his children. He nearly missed her, a dark heap against the backdrop of green and brown. He knelt beside her, his calloused hand hovering hesitantly before gently touching her shoulder. "Mary!" Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and filled with a bottomless sorrow. She didn't speak, didn't even seem to register his presence. He recognized the signs of utter exhaustion and despair. He had seen them mirrored in his own face in the days following his wife's death. He knew the emptiness, the crushing weight of grief that could steal the very will to live. Without a word, he carefully lifted her into his arms. She was light, too light, and he felt a pang of guilt. He should have done something, spoken out against the whispers, offered her some comfort. But he had been consumed by his own struggles, his own grief. He carried her back to his small, sparsely furnished cabin. His children, Thomas and Sarah, watched him with wide, curious eyes as he laid her on the cot that had once belonged to their mother. "She's sick," he explained, his voice gruff but gentle. "Fetch some water." Sarah, the younger of the two, hurried to obey, while Thomas remained by the door, his gaze fixed on Mary. Elias dampened a cloth and gently wiped her face, removing the dirt and tear streaks. He knew taking her in would invite more scrutiny, more whispers. But he couldn't leave her to die at the edge of the woods. He couldn't stand by and watch another life be consumed by despair. He would offer her what little he had: shelter, warmth, and a sliver of hope in the face of overwhelming darkness. He owed her that much at least, and perhaps, in helping her, he could find a way to mend the broken pieces of his own heart. A new beginning. The sun, a brassy weight overhead, pressed down on the valley floor. Mary, still fragile in body and spirit, drifted through the cabin like a wraith. Elias, since her awakening, hadn't tasked her with anything directly, his gaze averted. A grunted indication toward a mound of soiled garments was the extent of his communication, a need for clean laundry vaguely conveyed. She located the creek instinctively, its chilled current a brief respite against her fevered skin. Kneeling, she worked the coarse fabric against a smooth stone. Her husband's work shirts, Sarah's miniature frocks, Caleb's mud-caked breeches, each piece a tangible link to a life she had nearly relinquished. The labor was monotonous, yet grounding, the rhythmic scrub a steady thrum in the oppressive quiet that enveloped her. Afterward, she gravitated to the neglected garden behind a shack. Unruly weeds strangled the struggling plants, their leaves a faded green, coated in dust. Again, no direction from Elias, no acknowledgement even. She simply began to uproot the invaders, fingers delving into the parched soil. The earthy aroma, released by her efforts, offered an unexpected sweetness. From the doorway, Sarah and Caleb observed her, their expressions a mix of caution and curiosity. Ignoring them, she concentrated on her task. Finally, Caleb, emboldened perhaps by some inner prompting, edged closer. Pa says the squash bugs are awful this year. He volunteered, his voice a thread of sound. A faint smile touched Mary's lips. They are, she conceded. We'll have to get rid of them. That evening, after a sparse meal of beans and bread, Sarah tugged on Elias's sleeve. Tell a story, Papa, she begged, her voice small and reedy. Exhaustion etched lines on Elias' face. Too tired, sweetheart. Mary, silently clearing the remnants of their supper, paused. I know a story, she offered, her voice rusty from disuse. Elias's eyes narrowed, guarded. But Sarah and Caleb were instantly captivated. It's about a girl who lived deep in a forest, Mary began, her voice gaining confidence with each word. She spun a yarn of articulate creatures, clandestine trails, and a winsome imp. She evoked the whisper of foliage, the sharp scent of evergreens, the yielding texture of moss under bare feet. A conjured world of wonder, a stark contrast to their tough existence. Mesmerized, Sarah and Caleb crept closer, their eyes gleaming with fascination. Even Elias, slumped in the corner, seemed to soften, his gaze drawn to the dance of candlelight. Evening after evening, Mary shared her stories. Legends of valiant knights, faraway realms, and beings of magic. She fashioned silhouettes on the wall with her hands, bringing her characters to life. Slowly, tentatively, Sarah and Caleb emerged from their shells. They peppered her with questions, offered plot twists, even finished her sentences. One afternoon, as Mary repaired a rent in Caleb's pants, Sarah stole up beside her. Miss Mary, she inquired, her voice hushed. Can you really talk to foxes? Mary smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her entire face. Only in stories, sweetheart, she replied. Though if you listen close enough, you might hear them whispering too. Sarah mulled this over, her brow furrowed. Then, she reached out and touched Mary's hand, her small fingers surprisingly strong. Thank you, she breathed. The touch resonated through Mary, a sensation dormant for an eternity. Connection, purpose renewed, a fragile spark of hope. Looking at Sarah, at the unsullied faith in her gaze, a torrent of emotion surged within her. She swallowed hard, battling the tears threatening to overwhelm her. Later, as they gathered around the hearth fire, Caleb leaned against Mary, his small body a source of comfort. Elias observed them, his expression inscrutable. For the first time since her return, their eyes met. No warmth resided there, no absolution offered. Yet something else lingered, a shadow of gratitude. The path ahead remained daunting. She understood that. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Mary sensed a flicker of hope. Perhaps, within this desolate landscape, nestled within the embrace of these children, and under the watchful gaze of their father, a new future might be possible. The lost babe was gone, her past existence irrevocably changed, but possibly, just possibly, something beautiful could rise from the ashes. The notion, as delicate as a fledgling, lifted within her heart. The drought, dust devils, like spiteful imps, cavorted across the baked fields, a jeering dance for the withered corn. Each dawn bled into a bleaker, hotter sky. The river, once generous, now lay as a network of cracked clay. The drought had sunk its claws deep, and the settlement bled hope with every vanishing drop. Mary watched Thomas prod a dead clod, worry knitting his young brow. Nearby, Elias stood, shoulders bowed under a weight that seemed to have aged him by years. Even the livestock, sensing impending doom, traded their usual calls for a dispirited quiet. Pa says we might have to leave. Thomas breathed, barely audible. Mary knelt, gently sweeping a strand of hair from his face. We're not leaving, Thomas. We'll find a way. The assurance rang false, even to herself. That evening, during a sparse meal of rabbit stew, thinned with questionable potatoes, Elias broke the silence. We need to decide which animals go. We can't sustain them all anymore. His voice rasped, stripped bare of feeling. Despair washed through Mary, leaving a bitter taste. She pushed her bowl away. Elias, she began, tentative, back home, my family, we weathered droughts. We learned some tricks. He regarded her, his expression a locked door. Suspicion, perhaps, or simple weariness. Like what? He finally uttered curt. Mary described methods to conserve moisture, the use of dried grasses as mulch, the careful allocation of their meager water to crucial crops. She spoke of digging swales to capture even a trickle of rainwater. She felt absurd, a woman stripped bare by hardship offering advice to a man already stripped of everything. The ensuing silence pressed down, suffocating. A rough voice from the corner finally cracked the tension. Worth a shot, ain't it? Can't get much worse. A chorus of agreement rippled through the room. Elias remained mute, his gaze fixed on the candle's frail flame. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. All right, we'll try it your way, Mary. The following days became a whirlwind of activity. Mary, despite her own body still mending, labored alongside the others, her hands soon raw and blistered. She demonstrated the art of careful tilling, creating ridges to collect dew. She sent the children to gather fallen leaves and straw for mulch. Elias, initially wary, observed her with a growing something. Not admiration, perhaps, but a grudging respect beginning to bloom. Thomas, ever inquisitive, shadowed her, mimicking her actions with tireless enthusiasm. They channeled water from the dwindling well into carefully dug trenches around the cornstalks. The effort felt paltry, a mere thimbleful against the furnace of the drought. But Mary recalled her grandmother's wisdom. Even the smallest seed of hope can blossom in the most barren earth. Then, one morning, a week later, Mary noticed it. A whisper of green returning to a few cornstalks. A delicate, fragile sprout pushing through the cracked soil. She raced to Elias, her heart hammering against her ribs. He followed her to the field, his face carved with disbelief. He knelt, his calloused finger tracing the outline of the sprout. A spark flickered in his eyes, something akin to nascent hope. It wasn't a deliverance, not yet. The drought still held them captive. But it was a sign, a testament to their resilience. A sign that even in utter devastation, life could still claw its way back. Mary knew the path ahead would be long and brutal. But for the first time in an age, she felt a stirring of optimism, not only for the settlement but for herself. She'd found something to champion, something to nurture back to health. And in that act, she discovered a purpose, a reason to persevere, even when the world felt determined to crush her. A promise of hope. Hesitant green shoots, like tentative whispers, pushed through the cracked crust of the earth. Mary lavished them with the gray water she'd carefully rationed, murmuring encouragement into the baking air. Elias, a brooding figure on the porch, watched with arms folded, his expression a flinty landscape. While he hadn't actively undermined her, neither had he offered a hand. "They're doomed," he declared days before, his voice devoid of inflection. A fool's endeavor. Mary, however, refused to yield. Memories flooded her. The yielding springiness of rich soil, the earthy perfume of rain-soaked fields back home. This ravaged earth wasn't inherently sterile, just abandoned. Little Caleb, in contrast, shadowed her every move, mirroring her actions with unwavering concentration. He sculpted miniature furrows alongside her, patiently embedding the seeds she entrusted to him, drenching them with a gravity far exceeding his age. "Like this, Mary?" he'd inquire, head cocked, brow knit in concentration. Then, within the week, an unexpected blessing. Not merely sprouts, but resilient saplings, their leaves unfurling with an almost audible sigh of contentment. The other settlers, stunned by the improbable sight, began to wander over, their faces mirrors of disbelief. Mary demonstrated the construction of swales to harness the meager rainfall, the layering of dried grasses for moisture retention, the optimal spacing of plants to maximize growth. Skepticism gradually softened into hesitant collaboration. Even Elias, his gaze guarded, joined in, his movements initially stiff, but gradually becoming more fluid, more confident. The settlement had been resurrected. The crops flourished, sustained by Mary's expertise and the rekindled hope of the community. She became a symbol of fortitude in a land that had seemed determined to break them, an oasis. They lauded her as blessed, a miracle worker, but Mary understood that it was simply a dialogue with the land. One twilight, as the sun bled across the horizon in vibrant strokes of apricot and amethyst, Caleb approached, his small features troubled. "Mary," he began, scuffing at the parched ground with his sandal. I wasn't nice to you. I'm sorry." Mary knelt, framing his face with her hands. "You were afraid, Caleb. It's all right." He gazed up, his eyes glistening. "Can you forgive me?" A genuine smile illuminated her face, crinkling the corners of her eyes. "I already have, Caleb. I already have." Later, after Caleb and Sarah had drifted off to sleep, Elias found her on the porch, bathed in moonlight. He stood beside her in comfortable silence, the air humming with unspoken feelings. "Mary," he finally uttered, his voice a low rumble. "I was wrong. About everything." She remained silent, waiting. "You rescued us," he continued, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "You saved my children. You ignited a spark of hope in the darkness." He turned, his eyes reflecting a depth of emotion she hadn't witnessed before. "And I find myself yearning for you to stay. Not just as our teacher, but because I've come to care for you. More deeply than I imagined." Mary's heart fluttered erratically. She felt it too, this burgeoning connection, this unspoken understanding. But she'd been afraid to voice it, afraid to dream. "Elias," she breathed, her voice barely audible. He reached for her hand, his touch rough, yet infinitely tender. "I realize this is sudden," he began, "and I know you've endured so much. But would you consider remaining? As more than just an educator? As part of our family?" A solitary tear traced a path down her cheek, this time not a tear of sadness, but of pure elation, of solace, of a future she hadn't dared to envision. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, Elias, I would." Back east, Thomas stared at the horizon, a dark cloud settling over his features. He had anticipated the farm's demise without him. He had envisioned pleas for his return, desperate cries of famine and failure. Instead, whispers carried on the breeze spoke of abundant harvests and a woman who had breathed life back into the arid land. He'd heard the tales, of course, tales of her allure, her strength of will, and her growing stature within the community. He dismissed them as embellishments until a passing trader confirmed their veracity. She reigns there like a queen, the trader had declared, nursing his ale in the dusty tavern. Elias's children adore her. The whole place is thriving. A searing pang of regret twisted in Thomas's gut. He had been so certain of his own judgment, so self-assured in his authority. Now, he recognized the truth. He had been blinded by arrogance, by apprehension. He had forfeited something precious, something irreplaceable. And he knew, with a crushing certainty, that it was lost to him forever.